Covering Canada's parliament and various provincial legislatures in various provinces is something that many of you are probably familiar with. But what about covering legislatures in other parts of the world? Joining me today to discuss what it's like to cover the White House in the United States is Josh Wingrove, reporter for Bloomberg News at the White House. Josh, thank you for joining me. Maybe we'll start out with, I know you were a reporter in Parliament. You've covered the Harper government, you've covered the Trudeau government before you moved to Washington to start covering the American government. What has it been like, kind of making the transition from covering the Canadian government to covering an American government?
Well, it's pretty steep, as you know, and I think the Americans chiefly would love to have the power that Canadian prime ministers so often have. We're sitting here today, and Joe Biden is pretty frustrated that he can't get the plan that he wants to get passed, and that's because he's got these razor-thin majorities in Congress, and any one senator can sort of, stop the plan, hold it up, and he just doesn't have the power to ram stuff through, at least with the Congress he has, in the way that Canadian prime ministers have, even in minority government situations often, but certainly in majority government situations. So I think Joe Biden would like to have a lot of the tools that majority governments have in parliamentary systems, whether in Canada, the UK, or what have you. But other than that, it's we're seeing, of course, continued sort of overlap between these countries and the politics in them.
You just mentioned kind of, I guess, the ability to, pass legislation is a little bit easier even in the Canadian government than it would be with the American government. And I mean, when you look at kind of the current seat counts when you compare Canada to the United States, I mean, in Canada, if, let's say, a Liberal MP voted against a piece of legislation that its own party were to put forward, it's not a huge deal because they still have, a large majority of seats over any of the other parties, as opposed to when you look at the United States landscape. For example, if you look at the Build Back Better plan, when Joe Manchin is opposing the Build Back Better plan, it seems as if it's obviously a big deal because without people's support like Joe Manchin, it's hard to pass pieces of legislation like this. So maybe go into that a little bit more in depth, covering of big events and big legislation passing like the Build Back Better plan. What has it been like to cover a story where people are divided even amongst the party that put forward a piece of legislation such as that?
Well, I think we have cases of this in Canada too. It maybe not in quite the same high-profile way, but yeah, I mean, Joe Biden has said that it's like there's 50 presidents in the Senate, right? Any one Democrat can stop things because we're not really in a particular era of bipartisanship, and a lot of on this flagship stuff, Republicans are 50 out of 50 opposed, and so it's not like you can hope to pick up one moderate Republican if you lose one moderate Democrat on some of these sort of core Biden issues. Now, they have gotten some stuff done. Infrastructure bill is an example of that. They're wrangling now over sort of a China bill, so the Republicans, I think, would point to that to say they're not stemming everything. But yeah, I mean, Joe Manchin, he's a pretty rare case these days. He's a Democratic senator from a heavily red state. And so he, has a view about how he's got to do things. He can't just rubber stamp Joe Biden's agenda, or at least that's the impression he's giving. And so we'll see where they can go on it. They're trying right now to sort of revive parts of it as opposed to the whole Build Back Better package, which of course stalled out in December. And depending on who you ask, it's either, near dead or dead. Certainly in that form, pretty much everyone thinks it's not going anywhere.
With the 2022 midterm elections, I mean, people like Joe Manchin, how many people are there in the Democratic Party in the sense of, they support, the Democratic Party, but, maybe they also have to cater to a population that is, heavily Republican. And again, you mentioned someone like Joe Manchin, where he's from the state of West Virginia, which has been a lifelong, basically Republican state, but that now has a Democratic senator. How can people like Joe Manchin, manage that ahead of what will be a very interesting and busy midterm election year?
Well, he didn't always used to be an extinct or near extinct species. We've had this sort of like changes where, particularly in the House, the gerrymandering of these districts has made fewer and fewer House of Representatives districts actually competitive. And so you get, for the vast majority of members of the House, their chief rival is not the person that would run against them in the actual election. It's who might run against them for their own party's nomination. And you've seen this sort of like coalescing. Red states are increasingly red and blue states are increasingly blue. And we have fewer and fewer, Democratic senators from red states or Republican senators from blue states. And so the battle lines are sort of drawing tighter and tighter. You have some legacy ones still, but, we look back, 10, 12 years ago when I was younger than I am now, although not quite as fresh-eyed as some of the people on this call. It was totally different. Democrats had 60 seats at one point, and it was like it's wild how quickly this can change. And a lot of those 10 seats difference were in states that were, now considered pretty red. And so that's really a big change that's happened. And of course, if you're Democrat and your opposition is not a Republican, but another Democrat trying to out-Democrat you, or if you're a Republican and you're worried about sort of another Republican trying to out-Republican you or even out-Trump you in these cases, it incentivizes a lot of these lawmakers to go more sort of hardcore. You don't get a lot of moderates often holding down those kinds of seats, the same moderates that would win seats or districts that are actually more of a jump ball where either a Republican or a Democrat could win. But the betting right now, Wyatt, is that a lot of the House is not going to go very well necessarily this fall for the Democrats. Of course, never say never, but not a lot of Democrats are expressing a ton of optimism that it'll go well. But that redistricting process has gone better than at least some Democrats thought it would for them. So there's sort of a mixed emotion, I think is fair to say, right now. So, but historically, midterm elections are pretty bruising for presidents, no matter if it's a Republican or Democrat president. And of course, Donald Trump lost the House in his first midterm as well.
Okay, that is Josh Wingrove, reporter at the White House for Bloomberg News. Josh, thank you.
Thank you.